The most powerful man in Chicago had everything: fame, wealth, absolute control, until the night he fell. She was just a maid trying to help. He was dying from an illness, and everyone knew it. His brother, his men, his lawyers, they all turned their backs. But she stayed, and for that, he humiliated her. He called her nobody. He told her she was nothing. He made her feel like she didn't deserve to breathe the same air. But this 23-year-old cleaning woman did something that night that brought the most feared mafia boss in the city to his knees, with something his world had never seen before. The Kreshnik penthouse occupied the entire 47th floor of a glass tower on Lake Shore Drive, a monument to money and menace perched above a city that had long stopped asking where the fortune came from. Chicago spread below like an offering, the dark mirror of Lake Michigan, the amber grids of streetlights, the distant hum of 10 million lives that moved, in one way or another, under the invisible thumb of Sodor Kreshnik. He had built his empire the way his Albanian grandfather had built stone houses in the mountains of Gjirokastër, with hands that never trembled, with silence instead of speeches, and with the unshakable belief that a man who explains himself has already lost. By 43, Sodor controlled legitimate import businesses, 3 construction firms, a chain of high-end restaurants in the Gold Coast, and, beneath all of it, like a second skeleton, an intricate network of loan enforcement, territory agreements, and quiet violence that kept half the city's underworld in careful orbit around his name. He was not the kind of man you saw in movies. There were no gold chains, no shouting, no performative rage. Sodor Kreshnik was tall, lean, with the kind of face that looked carved from cold marble, high cheekbones, dark eyes set deep beneath a heavy brow, a jaw that seemed permanently clenched. His hair, still black but threaded now with silver at the temples, was always combed back with deliberate precision. He wore charcoal suits, never ties, and spoke in a low voice that forced people to lean in, to listen harder, to feel that whatever he said was a secret being entrusted to them. People feared him not because he was loud, but because he was exact. He remembered everything. He forgave nothing, and when someone crossed him, they didn't disappear in a hail of gunfire. They simply faded. Their businesses withered. Their partners stopped returning calls. Their loans were called in. It was a kind of social suffocation, slower than a bullet and far more terrifying because it left a man alive but hollowed out. This was the man that February found coughing into a silk handkerchief at 3 in the morning, his breath rattling in his chest like something broken inside a machine. It had started as nothing, a tightness behind his ribs after a meeting at the restaurant, a headache that wouldn't leave. He had ignored it, the way he ignored all weakness, the way his father had taught him to ignore a wound until the fight was over. But this was no wound he could stitch or wrap. This was something cellular, something that had crept in through the invisible architecture of his body and begun dismantling him from the inside. By the 3rd day, Sodor could not stand without the room tilting. His skin burned, his muscles ached as though they had been beaten. He moved through the penthouse like a ghost of himself, gripping walls, gripping countertops, refusing to sit down, because sitting down meant admitting that his legs had failed him. On the 4th day, his temperature reached 103.7. On the 5th day, it climbed to 104.2, and Sodor Kreshnik, the man who had once sat through a 6-hour negotiation with a bullet fragment in his shoulder, collapsed against the bathroom wall and could not get up. He lay there for 11 minutes before anyone found him. It was the maid. Her name was Elidi Morcelli, and she had been cleaning the Kreshnik penthouse for 7 months. She was 23, Moroccan-born, raised in Casablanca until she was 14, then brought to the United States by an aunt who had married a Tunisian mechanic in Bridgeport. Elidi had grown up between languages, Darija at home, French at school, English on the streets of Chicago's South Side, and had learned early that being multilingual in America meant being useful in ways that rarely led to respect. She was small, 5'3", with dark, curly hair she kept pinned back under a white headband, wide brown eyes that held a kind of permanent alertness, and hands that were always moving, folding, scrubbing, arranging, fixing. She wore the standard uniform the staffing agency required: black pants, white blouse, flat shoes, no jewelry, no perfume, no personality. That was the point. Domestic workers in homes like this were supposed to be furniture that moved. They were supposed to clean the glass and never look through it. They were supposed to hear conversations and immediately forget them. They were supposed to exist in the periphery of wealthy lives, close enough to serve, but far enough to never matter. Elodie understood this. She had understood it since her first week, when Soder's younger brother, Drighton Kreshnik, 38, sharp-faced, always smiling in a way that never reached his eyes, had walked past her in the hallway and said to the man beside him, in Albanian, assuming she couldn't understand, "At least this one knows how to disappear." She did know how to disappear. She had been disappearing her entire life, but she also noticed things. She noticed that Soder never ate breakfast before 10. She noticed that he drank his coffee black, but added a single cube of sugar when he thought no one was watching, as though sweetness were a private vice. She noticed that the books on his nightstand were not decorative. They were red, dog-eared, underlined. Dostoevsky, Ismail Kadare, Marcus Aurelius. She noticed that he kept a photograph in his top desk drawer, a woman with kind eyes, standing in front of a stone wall covered in grapevines. His mother, she guessed. Dead, she assumed. The frame was old. The glass was scratched but spotless, which meant he held it often. She noticed that despite the enormous penthouse, despite the rotating staff and the armed men who stood in the lobby like statues, Soder Kreshnik lived alone. There was no wife, no partner. No children's laughter echoing off the marble floors. There was just a man, his silence, and the empire that silence had built. And now that man was on the bathroom floor, drenched in sweat, his breath coming in shallow, ragged pulls, his eyes glassy with fever, and the first thing he said when he saw her standing in the doorway was, "Get out." Not a request, an order, even flat on his back, even with his body betraying him in every possible way. Soder Kreshnik could make two words sound like a threat. Elodie froze. Her hand was still on the doorframe. The bucket of cleaning supplies sat at her feet. She could smell the fever on him, that metallic, sour smell that sick bodies produce when they're burning through themselves. "Mr. Kreshnik, you need—" I said, "Get out." His voice cracked on the last word. He turned his face away from her, toward the wall, as though if he couldn't see her, she wasn't there, as though her witnessing this moment was worse than the illness itself. She left. She stood in the hallway for a full minute, her heart hammering, her mind racing through the practical calculations that had governed her entire life. If she called someone, who would come? If she reported this, would she lose her job? If she did nothing, and he died on that bathroom floor, what would happen to her? She went to the kitchen. She boiled water. She soaked a clean towel. She found the thermometer in the first aid kit that someone had stocked and clearly never opened. She poured a glass of water and added a pinch of salt, the way her grandmother in Casablanca had done for fevers. Not medicine, but something, a gesture, a beginning. She went back to the bathroom. He was still on the floor. His eyes were closed. His shirt was soaked through. For a moment, she thought he was unconscious, and something twisted in her chest. Not affection, not yet, but that human thing, that reflex that makes you reach for a person who is falling even if they've never reached for you. "I told you," he began. "I know what you told me," she said, and her voice surprised her. It was steady. It was not asking permission. "And I heard you, but I'm not leaving you on this floor." His eyes opened, dark, furious, and beneath the fury, something she had never seen in them before: fear. "I don't need your charity," he said. "It's not charity," she said. "It's my job to keep this house in order, and you being dead in the bathroom is not orderly." Something shifted in his expression, not softness. Soder Kreshnik did not do softness, but the faintest crack of surprise, as though her words had reached some part of him that his own defenses hadn't managed to wall off. He said nothing. She knelt beside him. She pressed the warm towel to his forehead. She held the glass of water to his lips and waited. He drank, not much, but he drank, and that was the first concession Soder Kreshnik had made to another human being in longer than either of them could remember. The word spread through the organization the way bad news always does, not through official channels, but through whispers, glances, the subtle recalibration of loyalty that happens when a king shows the first sign of mortality. Drayton Kreshnik learned of his brother's condition on the second day. He was at the restaurant on Rush Street, Epoch, the flagship, all dark wood and amber lighting. Sitting across from Genshin Dushku, Soder's longtime attorney and the only man who knew where every body was buried, both literally and metaphorically. "How bad?" Drayton asked, not looking up from his espresso. "Bad enough that he hasn't answered his phone in 36 hours, Genshin said. He was 61, bald, with the careful eyes of a man who had spent 4 decades watching powerful people destroy themselves. "I sent Dr. Militia. Soder refused to see him, told him through the intercom to leave." Drayton smiled. That flat, mechanical smile. "Of course he did. This isn't a joke, Drayton." "I'm not laughing." Drayton set his cup down. "I'm calculating." And he was. Behind those sharp eyes, behind that carefully maintained veneer of fraternal concern, Drayton Kreshnik was running numbers. Not financial numbers, political ones. The calculus of succession, the arithmetic of opportunity. Drayton had always been the second son, always one step behind, always introduced as Soder's brother, never as Drayton, never as his own man. He had managed the construction side of the business, supervised the territory agreements on the west side, handled the relationships with the police contacts that kept operations smooth. He was competent, effective, and utterly invisible beside his brother's shadow. He had accepted this, or at least he had appeared to accept it, but acceptance and resignation are different animals, and Drayton had been waiting. Not plotting, not yet, but waiting, for the moment when the balance might shift. Now the balance was shifting. "What does the doctor think?" Drayton asked. Based on what little the staff described, could be severe pneumonia, could be something worse, some kind of systemic infection. Without proper examination, there's no way to know. "And he won't be examined." "No." Drayton was quiet for a long time. Then he said very softly, "Then we prepare for contingencies." Genshin stared at him. "Your brother is not dead, Drayton." "My brother is a man who won't see a doctor while his body is shutting down." "That's not strength, Genshin. That's a death wish wearing pride as a mask." He stood, straightened his jacket. "Move the Thursday meeting to the restaurant. I'll chair it. Tell the captains it's routine, just logistical while Soder rests." "And if Soder finds out?" "If Soder finds out, it means he's well enough to be angry. And if he's well enough to be angry, then none of this matters." He paused at the door. "But if he's not well enough, then it matters very much." Within 48 hours, Drayton had quietly repositioned himself at the center of the operation. The meetings moved to Epoch. The captains, men who had pledged their loyalty to Soder, began drifting into Drayton's orbit, not out of love, but out of the oldest instinct in any power structure. Follow the man who feeds you tomorrow, not the one who fed you yesterday. Phone calls to the penthouse went unanswered. Deliveries were left at the door by staff who had been told, by whom, no one was quite sure, that Mr. Kreshnik preferred not to be disturbed. The empire was not collapsing. It was being quietly, carefully, methodically rearranged. And on the 47th floor of the glass tower on Lakeshore Drive, Soder Kreshnik lay in his bed, burning with fever, and felt the silence closing in around him like water. Elidi came every day. Not because she was told to. The staffing agency had reduced her schedule to twice a week, citing client preference, which she understood was code for nobody wants to deal with this. Not because she was paid extra. She wasn't. She came because when she closed her eyes at night in her small apartment in Pilsen, she could still see him on that bathroom floor, his face turned to the wall, his body shaking, and something in her refused to let that image go unanswered. She used her key card. She let herself in. She cleaned, she cooked, she checked on him. And every day, he made it harder. On the 6th day, she brought him soup, a simple harira, the way her mother used to make it, thick, with lentils and tomato and cumin. She set it on his nightstand. He looked at it, then at her, and said, "I didn't ask for this." "I know. Take it away." "No." His jaw tightened. Even in illness, even with his skin pale and his eyes ringed with dark circles, his anger was a physical thing. It filled the room, pressed against the walls, demanded space. "You think this makes you important," he said. "You think because you bring me soup, you become something? You're a cleaning woman. You're nobody. You don't get to decide what I eat." The words hit her like stones. She felt them land, in her chest, in her stomach, in that soft place where she kept the version of herself that still believed kindness was worth the cost. She said nothing. She turned. She walked to the door. Then she stopped. "The soup will be cold in an hour," she said without turning around. "If you eat it cold, it won't taste as good. But it'll still keep you alive. And I think, Mr. Kreshnik, that staying alive is more important than staying proud." She left. When she came back 2 hours later to retrieve the bowl, it was empty. Neither of them mentioned it. On the 7th day, his fever spiked again. She found him sitting on the outward edge of his bed, gripping the mattress with white-knuckled hands, his body rocking slightly back and forth. A motion she recognized because she had seen her aunt do the same thing during a kidney infection, that involuntary swaying of a body, trying to manage pain it cannot process. "Mr. Kreshnik," she said from the doorway. He didn't look up. "What?" "Your temperature. Let me check." "No." She walked in anyway. She held out the thermometer. He stared at it as though it were a weapon. "I'm not a child," he said. "Then stop acting like one." The words escaped before she could catch them. She heard them hang in the air between them, outrageous, insubordinate, the kind of thing that in his world would have consequences. He looked at her, really looked at her, not through her, not past her, at her. And in that look she saw something she hadn't expected, the faintest flicker of what might have been admiration, or maybe it was just exhaustion so deep that his defenses had holes in them. He took the thermometer, 104.1. "You need a doctor," she said. "I have a doctor. I don't want a doctor." Those are two different statements. He almost smiled. Almost. The corner of his mouth moved a fraction of an inch, then stopped, as though even his facial muscles had been trained against vulnerability. "Why are you here?" he asked, not angry now, genuinely confused. "The agency reduced your hours." "I know that. I heard the call. You're not being paid for this." Elodie considered the question. She could have lied, could have said she was just being thorough, or that the agency had changed its mind, or any number of convenient fictions. But something about the rawness of this moment, something about this powerful man, sitting on the edge of his bed, unable to stand without swaying, made her want to answer honestly. "Because nobody else is coming," she said. "I've been here every day this week. No one has come to see you. No one has called this phone." She gestured to the landline on his nightstand. "Your brother hasn't been here. Your men haven't been here. The doctor you refused, nobody sent another one." She watched the words register, watched them move across his face like a shadow. "You're alone, Mr. Kreshnik," she said. "And no one should die alone. Not even someone who tells me to get out every time I walk in." The silence that followed was the loudest thing either of them had ever heard. He lay back against the pillows. He closed his eyes. And very quietly, so quietly she almost missed it, he said, "Soder." "What?" "My name. It's Soder. If you're going to insist on saving my life, you might as well use my actual name." It was not an apology. It was not kindness. But it was an opening, a crack in the stone wall he had spent 43 years building, and Elodie recognized it for what it was. Soder. she repeated. Eat the soup. I made extra. She brought the bowl. He ate, and for the first time since his fever began, someone sat in a chair beside his bed and stayed. It was a Tuesday, 2:17 in the morning. February had turned savage. The wind off the lake hammered against the tower's windows with a sound like muffled artillery, and the temperature outside had plunged to 7 degrees below zero. Elidi had gone home at 9. She had left a thermos of broth on his nightstand, checked his temperature, 102.8, lower than the day before, a small mercy, and told him to drink the full thermos before sleeping. He had nodded, which was more cooperation than she had gotten in a week. At 1:45, her phone rang. It was the building's night security, a man named Theodore, Romanian, ex-military, the kind of man who kept a flashlight on his belt, even in well-lit hallways. He spoke in that flat, careful voice that people use when they are describing something they wish they hadn't seen. Miss Morselli, I'm calling because there's been an alert from the 47th floor. The medical monitor, the one you asked us to install on the door sensor, it triggered. I went up. The front door's locked, but I can hear him through the door. He's on the floor again. I think he fell. I think it's bad. Did you call his brother? A pause. I called the number on the emergency list. Mr. Drayton Kreshnik's assistant answered. She said he's unavailable. Unavailable. That's what she said. Did you call anyone else on the list? I called 4 numbers, miss. 2 went to voicemail. 1 said he'd look into it. The last one, Mr. Dushku, the attorney, he said, and I'm quoting, handle it locally. We're managing the situation. Elidi sat in the dark of her apartment. She listened to the wind outside. She listened to the blood pounding in her ears. She thought of every cruel word Soder, Kreshnik, had said to her. She thought of the way he had turned his face to the wall rather than let her see him weak. She thought of the empty soup bowl. She thought of the way he had said his name, Soder, like he was handing her a key to a door he had kept locked his whole life. I'm coming, she said. She dressed in 3 minutes. She called an Uber. The ride from Pilsen to Lakeshore Drive took 14 minutes at that hour. No traffic, just empty streets glazed with ice and the distant red pulse of traffic lights changing for no one. She used her key card. She took the elevator to 47. She opened the door. The penthouse was dark, not the darkness of sleep, but the darkness of absence. Every light off, every curtain drawn, as though the apartment itself had given up. She found him in the hallway between the bedroom and the bathroom. He was on his side, his cheek pressed against the cold marble floor, his body curled in on itself. His breathing, was wrong. Too fast, too shallow, with a wet, crackling sound on each exhale that she recognized from her aunt's illness. The sound of lungs that were filling. Soder. She dropped to her knees beside him. Her hand went to his forehead. The heat was immense, not the steady burn of the previous days, but something spiking, something desperate. His skin was the color of ash. His lips were dry, cracked, almost blue at the edges. His eyes opened, barely. He looked at her as though from a great distance, as though he were already somewhere else, and she was a figure on a shore he was drifting away from. You came back, he whispered. I told you, no one should die alone. Everyone dies alone. His voice was barely a sound. That's the only honest thing about it. Not tonight, she said. She moved with the focused efficiency of someone who has been preparing for a crisis without knowing it. She pulled blankets from the bedroom and wrapped him where Hiftekoforfo lay, knowing that moving him alone was too risky. His body was too heavy, too fragile, and the wrong kind of fall could break something that was already on the verge of breaking. She elevated his head with pillows. She brought water and held it to his lips, tilting the glass slowly, the way nurses do, the way her grandmother had done for her grandfather in the last months. He drank in small, reluctant sips, his throat working painfully. Then she made a phone call that would, in retrospect, change everything. She did not call Drayton. She did not call Genshin Dushku. She did not call anyone on the emergency list that had already failed him. She called Dr. Irfan Hadjic. Dr. Hadjic was 64 years old, Bosnian-born, a former field surgeon who had worked through the siege of Sarajevo and had later rebuilt his practice in Chicago's Albany Park neighborhood. He treated the immigrant community, the people who couldn't go to hospitals because of their papers, the people who paid in cash and asked no questions. He was not part of Soder's world. He had no connections to the organization. He owed nothing to anyone, and that was exactly why Elidi trusted him. She had met him 2 years ago, when her aunt's husband had fallen at the shop and needed stitches, but was terrified of the hospital. Dr. Hadjic had come at midnight, sutured the wound on the kitchen table, refused payment, and said only, "Call me if you need me again. I don't sleep much anyway." He answered on the second ring, "Dr. Hadjic, it's Elidi Morselli." "The niece, I remember. What happened?" "I have a man. 43. High fever for over a week, possibly higher than 104 tonight. Wet cough, crackling in the lungs. He collapsed. He's conscious but barely. He refuses hospitals." A pause. "Refuses or can't?" "Both." "Address?" She gave it. She heard him moving already. Keys, a door, the sound of a car starting. 30 minutes, he said. "Keep him warm. Keep him awake. If he stops breathing, call 911. Pride won't matter then." She hung up. She turned back to Soder. His eyes were closed again. His breathing labored, each inhale a small battle. "Soder, stay with me." "Tired," he murmured. "I know, but you don't get to quit. Not yet." "Why not?" It wasn't a question. It was the voice of a man who had surveyed his life from the floor of his own hallway and found it insufficient. "Because you haven't finished your soup," she said, and incredibly, impossibly, the corner of his mouth twitched. Dr. Hadjic arrived in 26 minutes. He was a lean man with wire-rimmed glasses and the unflappable manner of someone who had treated gunshot wounds by candlelight. He examined Soder on the hallway floor with the kind of gentle efficiency that made the enormous penthouse feel, for a moment, like a field hospital. His diagnosis was grim but precise. Bilateral pneumonia. Severe. He's also showing signs of sepsis. The infection has likely entered the bloodstream. His blood pressure is low. His oxygen saturation is dropping. He needs IV antibiotics, fluids, and monitoring. If I had proper equipment, I'd want a chest x-ray, but we work with what we have. Can you treat him here? I can stabilize him. I can start IV antibiotics. I can monitor his vitals through the night. But I'll be honest with you, Miss Morselli, if he doesn't respond to treatment in the next 12 to 18 hours, he needs a hospital." No negotiation. Elidi looked at Soder. He was watching her, not the doctor, her, with those dark, fever-bright eyes. Waiting. Trusting her to make the decision because he no longer trusted himself to make it. "Do it," she said. Dr. Hadjic worked for an hour. He started an IV line with practiced hands. He administered broad-spectrum antibiotics. He rigged a pulse oximeter to Soder's finger and set up a manual blood pressure cuff. He adjusted the pillows, raised the blankets, and spoke to Soder the way he spoke to all his patients, calmly, directly, without the false cheer that doctors in expensive hospitals used like anesthesia. "You are very sick," Dr. Hadjic told him, "but you are not dead, and you will not be dead tonight if you cooperate. Can you do that?" Soder looked at the old doctor, then at Elidi. "Apparently," he said hoarsely, "I don't have a choice." "You always have a choice," Dr. Hadjic said. "Tonight you're choosing to live. That's a good choice." The doctor left at 4:30 in the morning with instructions for Elidi that covered 3 handwritten pages. Check the IV every 2 hours. Monitor his temperature every 90 minutes. Wake him if his breathing changes. Call immediately if his lips turn blue. Elidi sat in the chair beside him. The penthouse was silent except for the wind and his breathing and the slow drip of the IV. Turn to force. 5:15. Soder opened his eyes. "You should go home," he said. His voice was thin, but clearer than before. "I should," she agreed. But I won't. A long silence. I was cruel to you, he said, not an apology. He didn't know how to apologize, but an acknowledgement. A man holding up a mirror and not flinching from what he saw. Yes, she said. You were. Why did you come back? She thought about it. The real answer was complicated, a tangle of empathy and stubbornness, and something she couldn't name. Something that had to do with seeing a man who was drowning and recognizing the water because she had been in water like that before. Because cruelty is not a reason to let someone die, she said. And because I think the man who said those things to me isn't the man lying here right now. I think the man who said those things was afraid, and fear makes people say terrible things. He stared at the ceiling. The IV dripped. The wind howled. I have been afraid, he said, my entire life. I just got very good at hiding it. It was the most honest thing Soter Kreshnik had ever said to another human being. And he said it to a cleaning woman who was sitting in a chair in his hallway at 5 in the morning, holding a glass of water she had warmed with her own hands. Elodie said nothing. She didn't need to. She simply refilled the glass, held it out, and waited. He drank. The antibiotics worked, not immediately. Nothing in real medicine is immediate. But by the third day, after Dr. Hadjich's intervention, Soter's fever dropped to 101. By the 5th day, it was 99.4. By the 7th day, the crackling in his lungs had quieted. His color had returned, and he could sit up in bed without the room spinning. Dr. Hadjich came every other day. He was pleased, but cautious. The body recovers, he said, packing his bag after the 4th visit. But so must the mind. He's been, under tremendous physical stress. He'll be weak for weeks. He needs rest. Real rest. He doesn't know how to rest, Elodie said. Then teach him. Teaching Soter Kreshnik to rest was like teaching a storm to whisper. He fought recovery with the same ferocity he had fought everything in his life, as though recuperation were an enemy to be dominated rather than a process to be trusted. On the first day he could stand, he insisted on walking to his study. He made it halfway down the hall before his legs buckled. Elodie caught him, or rather, she braced herself against the wall and let him lean into her, her small frame somehow absorbing the weight of a man nearly a foot taller, holding him upright with a stubbornness that matched his own. Don't, he said through gritted teeth. Don't tell me to go back to bed. I wasn't going to. I was going to suggest the study can wait, and that the living room sofa is closer. You can sit there and look at the lake and pretend you're working. He looked down at her. She was still bracing him, her hands steady on his arm, her feet planted. There was no pity in her face, no triumph, just that calm, practical intelligence that he was beginning to find more disarming than any weapon. Fine, he said. The sofa. She helped him to the living room. She brought his laptop, his phone, a glass of water. She went back to cleaning, because she was still, nominally, the maid, and the penthouse had accumulated a week's worth of dust and neglect. But something had changed in the geometry of their interactions. He no longer dismissed her when she entered a room. He no longer turned his face away. Instead, he would watch her, not staring, not leering, but observing the way she moved through spaces, the efficiency of her hands, the way she straightened a cushion or aligned a stack of books, with the same unconscious precision he brought to a negotiation. One afternoon, while she was wiping down the kitchen island, he said from the sofa, "You read." She looked up. "What?" "The other day, I saw you looking at the bookshelf in my study, not just looking, reading the spines. You tilted your head the way people do when they're deciding whether to pick something up." She felt a flush creep up her neck. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have, I'm not accusing you. I'm asking." He paused. "What do you read?" It was such an unexpected question. This feared man, this lord of violence and silence, asking his maid what books she liked, that Elodie almost laughed, almost. Instead she said, "Novels. Mostly French. I grew up with French literature in school. Camus. Duras. Recently I found a translation of Kadari at the library. The General of the Dead Army." Something changed in his face. A light. A recognition. You've read Kadare? Just that one. It was in the international section. I didn't know who he was until I started reading, and then I couldn't stop. He's Albanian, Soter said. Like my family. I know. I looked him up after. For the first time since she had known him, Soter Kreshnik looked at her with something beyond acknowledgement. It was a kind of wonder, the surprise of finding something valuable in a place where you hadn't thought to look. There's a copy of Broken April on my shelf, he said. Second row. You can borrow it if you want. I want, she said. He almost smiled again. This time, the corner of his mouth moved a full quarter-inch. The days settled into a rhythm. She would arrive in the morning, still technically cleaning, still technically invisible, and the line between her duties and her presence began to blur. She cleaned, yes, she cooked, yes. But she also sat with him during the long afternoons, when the lake turned silver and the silence of the penthouse pressed in like a weight. And they talked, not much at first. He was not a man who talked easily, and he told her about Albania. He told her about Albania, about his grandfather's village, about the code of honor that had governed his family for generations. The Bisa, the sworn word, the idea that a man's promise was more binding than any contract. He told her about coming to America at 12, about the shock of a country that valued noise over substance, about how he had learned to survive by becoming the quietest person in every room. She told him about Casablanca, about the Medina's narrow streets, the smell of orange blossoms and diesel, the way the call to prayer had been the rhythm of her childhood. About her mother, who had died when she was 10. Breast cancer, caught too late because they couldn't afford the tests that would have caught it early. About her aunt, who had brought her to Chicago and given her a life she hadn't asked for, but had learned to build within. You lost your mother young, he said one afternoon. His voice was careful, as though he were handling something fragile. I did. I lost mine when I was 30. Stroke, fast. I was in a meeting when it happened. By the time I got to the hospital, she was gone. He paused. I have never forgiven myself for being in a meeting. You couldn't have known. No, but I should have been the kind of man who wasn't always in meetings. He looked at his hands. Large hands, scarred at the knuckles, hands that had done things he would never tell her. I should have been the kind of man who was present. Instead, I built an empire that required my absence from everything that mattered. Elidi said nothing for a long time. Then, you could become that man now. He looked at her. Now? Why not? You're recovering. You're in a room with books and a lake, and no one asking you to be anything. When was the last time you had that? He thought about it. Never, he said. I've never had that. Then have it now. It was such a simple invitation, such a small, human thing, but it landed in Soter Kreshnik, like a stone dropping into a well he hadn't known was there, deep, dark, and unexpectedly full. Drayton came on a Thursday. 2 weeks had passed since the crisis night, and Soter was strong enough to stand, to walk, to speak without the rasp of fever in his throat. He was not yet the man he had been. The illness had carved away 10 pounds from his frame, and there were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there before, but the core of him, that granite center, had returned, diminished perhaps, but intact. Elidi was in the kitchen when the elevator opened, and Drayton walked in, flanked by 2 men she didn't recognize, not the usual security detail, but new faces, hard faces, men who had been chosen for their loyalty to a different Kreshnik. Brother, Drayton said, spreading his arms in a gesture of warmth that had the temperature of a November lake. You look better than I feared. Soter was standing at the living room window, his back to the room. He did not turn around. How would you know what to fear? You haven't been here. I was told you wanted privacy. By whom? A pause. Drayton's smile flickered, then stabilized. By your people, your staff. They said you were resting, that you preferred my people. Soter turned now, slowly, and Elidi saw Drayton's expression shift. A micro-adjustment, the kind only a trained observer would catch. Ote, Fear. Drayton was afraid, not of the illness, not of the weakness, of the fact that his brother was still standing. My people didn't call back when the building security reported I was unconscious on the floor. My people moved the business meetings to your restaurant. My people stopped coming. He took a step forward. Were you waiting for me to die, Drayton? That's a disgusting thing to say. Then disgust me with your answer. The room was a held breath. The two men behind Drayton shifted, uncertain. Elodie stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, a dish towel in her hand, invisible the way she had trained herself to be, but hearing everything, registering every word the way she always had. Drayton's eyes moved to her, locked. Something cold passed through his expression. Calculation, reassessment, threat. Perhaps, Drayton said, his voice dropping, we should discuss this privately, without the help. She stays, Soder said. Drayton blinked. She's a cleaning woman. She was the only person in this building who cared whether I lived or died. So she stays and you explain yourself. Something ugly moved beneath Drayton's careful surface. He straightened, adjusted his cufflinks, smiled that hollow smile. Fine. You want to know what happened? I'll tell you. You were sick. You refused help. You refused doctors. You refused your own brother. So I did what any responsible man would do. I kept the business running. I met with the captains. I honored our agreements. I made sure that while you were lying in your bed, choosing pride over survival, the entire operation didn't collapse. You moved to replace me. I moved to protect what you built. There's a difference. The difference, Soder said, and his voice was quiet now, quieter than Drayton had ever heard it, which meant it was at its most dangerous, is that you didn't call, not once, not to ask if I was alive, not to send a doctor, not to check on your own blood. You calculated the odds, Drayton. You decided I was more useful dead, and you began building a world without me in it. Drayton said nothing. For once the smile was gone. Do you deny it? A long silence. Then Drayton said very carefully, I deny nothing. I prepared for the worst. That is what survivors do. Survivors, Soder repeated the word like it, was something he'd found at the bottom of a glass. Our grandfather used a different word. He called it betrayal. Drayton's composure finally cracked. Color rushed into his face. His voice rose. You want to talk about betrayal? You who kept me in your shadow for 20 years. You who never once said my name in a room without saying yours first. I built half of what we have. The construction, the West Side, the police contacts. And you treated me like hired help. His eyes shot to Elodie. Speaking of hired help, how convenient. The great Soder Kreshnik, humbled by illness, nursed back to health by the maid. How touching, how strategic. Careful, Soder said. Oh, I'm being careful. I'm being very careful. Because I've seen this before, brother. A powerful man gets weak. A pretty young woman sees an opportunity. She makes herself indispensable. She makes herself trusted. And before you know it, she's not cleaning the floors anymore. She's sitting at the table. He turned to Elodie. His eyes were flat, reptilian. How much did you think this was worth? The sick man, the empty penthouse, the intimate little nights of soup and pillow fluffing? What's the price tag on that performance? The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of violence, full of history, full of the centuries-old weight of men who had used power to strip others of their dignity. Elodie felt the words like a brand. She felt them burn through the layers of composure she had built over years of being invisible, being dismissed, being tolerated but never valued. She felt her hands shake. She felt her throat close. She felt the tears press against the back of her eyes with a force that terrified her, because crying in front of this man would prove everything he was saying. She opened her mouth to speak, to defend herself, to explain, to rage. She didn't get the chance. Enough. Soder's voice filled the room like thunder, fills a valley, not loud, but total, occupying every corner, leaving no space for anything else. He moved toward his brother with a slowness that was more frightening than speed, because it was controlled, deliberate, and final. You will not speak to her. You will not look at her. You will not say her name. She came to this apartment every day while I was dying. She brought a doctor when no one else would. She sat in a chair next to my bed at 3 in the morning and kept me alive with water and stubbornness and a kind of courage that you, Drayton, with all your suits and your smiles and your calculations, will never understand. He was close to his brother now, close enough to touch, close enough to break. She asked for nothing, not money, not protection, not status, nothing. She did what she did because it was right, and if you cannot recognize that, if your mind is so poisoned by ambition that you see manipulation and mercy, then you are not the brother I thought you were. You are not even the man I hoped you could become. Drayton's face was white. The two men behind him were statues. Get out, Soder said. Take your new men with you and understand this clearly. The next time you enter this building, you will come alone. You will come respectfully, and you will come prepared to account for every decision you made while I was on that floor. Drayton left. The elevator doors closed, and the penthouse was quiet again. Soder stood at the window. His hands were trembling, from emotion, from exertion, from the sheer physical cost of confrontation when his body was still healing. He braced himself against the glass. Elodie came to him. Not rushing, not hovering, just walking to his side the way a person walks to a cliff's edge, carefully, but without fear. You didn't have to do that, she said. Yes, he said. I did. He's your brother. He was my brother. Today he showed me what he is. He paused. You showed me what you are a long time ago. I was just too proud to see it. He turned from the window. He looked at her. Really looked at her the way he had on the bathroom floor that first time, but different now, not through a haze of fever or pride. With clarity. With the clean, painful clarity of a man who had been to the edge of death and come back seeing the world as it actually was. Thank you, he said. 2 words. But from Soder Kreshnik, they carried the weight of a continent. Elodie nodded. She did not cry. She did not throw her arms around him. She did not perform gratitude or relief or any of the emotions that a lesser storyteller might have demanded of her. She simply said, "You're welcome. Now sit down before you fall again." He sat. What Drayton did not know, what no one knew except Elodie and a dead phone battery, was that on the night of the crisis, while Dr. Hadjic worked on Soder and Elodie monitored his breathing, she had done something else. She had not planned it. She was not a strategist. She was not a player in the games of powerful men. But she was observant, pathologically, survival necessarily observant. And in the weeks of cleaning Soder's penthouse, she had noticed things. She had noticed that Soder kept a safe in his study, not the wall safe that everyone knew about. The obvious one behind the painting, the one that held cash and a weapon and the kind of documents that men like Soder kept as insurance. No. She had noticed a second safe, a floor safe, hidden beneath a section of hardwood that was slightly different in color from the surrounding planks, positioned under the desk in a way that you would only see it if you were on your hands and knees cleaning the baseboards. Which she was, every Tuesday. She didn't know the combination. She didn't know what was inside. But she had noticed something else. On the night Soder collapsed, his desk was in disarray. Unusual for a man who kept his environment as controlled as his empire. Papers were scattered. His laptop was open to an email. And beside the laptop, on a yellow legal pad in Soder's precise handwriting, was a list. Transfer of authority documents. Power of attorney revocable. Operating agreements, 3 LLCs. Bank signatory changes. Below the list, underlined twice, do not sign. DK cannot have access. DK, Drayton Kreshnik. Elodie understood. She understood with the quick, sharp comprehension of someone who had grown up watching power dynamics in small spaces, in crowded apartments, in neighborhoods where a landlord's signature could evict a family, where paperwork was a weapon as lethal as any gun. Soder had been preparing to protect himself. He had been gathering the documents that Drayton would need to formally take control of the legitimate businesses, the ones that laundered the money, that provided the legal infrastructure for everything beneath, and, he had been keeping those documents out of Drayton's reach. But now Soder was unconscious, and those documents were on his desk, unsecured, in an apartment that Drayton had a key card to enter. Elodie had 30 seconds of decision-making. The doctor was stabilizing Soder. The IV was in. The building was quiet, and somewhere in the city, Drayton Kreshnik was doing the math of succession. She gathered the papers. She photographed them with her phone. Every page, every signature line, every clause. Then she put the originals back on the desk, exactly as they had been, and returned to Soder's side. The photographs sat on her phone for 2 weeks, silent, waiting, when Soder was well enough to return to his study. The day after Drayton's visit, in fact, he went to his desk and froze. Elodie was in the kitchen. She heard the silence change. There are different kinds of silence in a home. The silence of absence, the silence of concentration, the silence of sleep. This was the silence of alarm. She walked to the study doorway. Soder was standing at his desk, staring at the papers. His face was carved stone. "These were moved," he said. "They were on your desk the night you collapsed," Elodie said. He looked at her sharply. "You saw them?" "I saw them. I didn't read them in detail, but I saw the note, the one about the transfer documents." His jaw tightened. "What did you do?" She took out her phone. She opened the photo album. She held it out to him. "I photographed everything, every page, in case someone came while you were unconscious and took the originals or altered them. I didn't know what they meant exactly, but I knew they mattered, and I knew you wouldn't want someone else to have them." He scrolled through the photographs, slowly. His expression moved through a sequence she could track: surprise, suspicion, verification, understanding, and then, finally, unmistakably, something that looked, like gratitude so deep it bordered on grief. "These are the operating agreements for the 3 holding companies that control the construction firms," he said quietly. "If Drayton had gotten his hands on these and had them signed by a notary while I was incapacitated, he could have legally restructured the ownership. He could have locked me out of my own businesses." "I know," Elodie said. "I mean, I didn't know exactly, but I understood the shape of it." "The shape of it." He repeated her words, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Awe. A man who had spent his life surrounded by soldiers and strategists, staring at a 23-year-old maid who had instinctively done what none of them had thought to do. "Why?" he asked. "You could have ignored it. You could have let him take whatever he wanted. It's not your fight." Elodie considered the question the way she considered all important questions, carefully, without hurry. "Because you were helpless," she said. "And taking from someone who is helpless is the worst kind of theft. It doesn't matter who you are or what you've done. No one deserves to be robbed while they're dying." "Oh." He set the phone down on the desk. He pressed his palms flat against the surface, steadying himself, not physically this time, but emotionally, anchoring himself against the current of something he did not know how to feel. "You're remarkable," he said. "And I don't say that to people. I know you don't. What do you want, Elodie? For this? For everything? What can I give you?" And here it was. The moment that would define her in his world. The question that every person in Soder Kreshnik's orbit eventually faced. "What is your price?" "Nothing," she said. He stared at her. "Nothing. Nothing. I didn't do it for payment. I didn't do it for position. I didn't do it so that you would owe me." She held his gaze with a steadiness that startled them both. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. And if you try to pay me for doing the right thing, you'll cheapen it, and you'll cheapen me." The silence that followed was vast, oceanic, the kind of silence that falls after a truth so clean and so complete that there is nothing left to add to it. Soder Kreshnik, who had bought loyalty, who had purchased compliance, who had traded in debts and obligations his entire life, stood in his study and faced a woman who could not be bought. Not because she was naive, not because she didn't understand the value of what she had done, but because she had decided, deliberately, consciously, firmly, that her integrity was worth more than anything he could offer. He didn't know what to do with that. He had no framework for it. It was like being handed a color he had never seen before and being asked to describe it. "All right," he said very quietly. "Nothing it is." But his eyes, when he looked at her, said everything Fatih's or words could not. The reckoning came 3 weeks later. Soder had recovered enough to reassert himself, not fully, not with the effortless physical dominance of before, but with something that might have been more formidable, the cold, deliberate precision of a man who had seen the truth of every relationship in his life and was now operating without illusions. He called a meeting. Not at Epic, at the penthouse. His territory. His altitude. The men came, the captains, the attorneys, the financial managers, the men who move the money and the men who move the bodies. Drayton came too, though he had to be summoned twice, which told Soder everything he needed to know about the state of his brother's conscience. Elodie was not invited to the meeting. She was, in fact, asked to take the day off. She refused. "I'll be in the kitchen," she told Soder that morning. "I have cleaning to do." He looked at her. He understood what she was doing. She was, choosing to be present. Not as a participant, but as a witness. She was refusing to be erased from the story simply because powerful men were about to have a powerful conversation. "The kitchen," he said. "Fine." The meeting lasted 4 hours. From the kitchen, through the careful acoustics of the penthouse, Elodie heard fragments. She heard Soder's voice, low, controlled, devastating. She heard him lay out the timeline, the unanswered calls, the redirected meetings, the subtle repositioning of loyalties. She heard him present evidence, not accusations, not emotions, but documents, bank transfers, meeting minutes, phone records, the cold architecture of his brother's ambition, reconstructed with forensic precision. She heard Drayton's defense, heard it rise in pitch, in desperation, in the ugly cadence of a man whose carefully constructed narrative was being dismantled in front of the only audience that mattered. She heard the captain's silence, the most telling sound of all, the silence of men who were choosing sides by not speaking. She did not hear the outcome. She did not need to. When the men filed out of the penthouse 4 hours later, some pale, some shaken, all carrying the look of men who had witnessed a power restructure and were recalculating their own positions, Drayton was not among them. He had left an hour earlier, alone. Soder found Elodie in the kitchen, cleaning the same countertop she had been cleaning for 30 minutes. "It's done," he said. "Iffy, what's done?" "Drayton has been removed from all operational roles. He retains his personal assets. I'm not going to impoverish my own brother, but he has no authority, no access, and no seat at any table in this organization." He paused. "He'll keep the apartment in Lincoln Park. He'll keep his cars. He'll keep his dignity or whatever's left of it. But he is finished." "Is that enough?" she asked, not challenging, genuinely asking. "It's more than he deserves, and less than he fears." He leaned against the kitchen island. "I also made changes to the operating agreements. New signatory requirements. New succession protocols. If anything happens to me, control doesn't default to family. It defaults to a trust administered by Gentian and 2 independent attorneys." "Smart." "No. Overdue." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I told them about the photographs." Elodie's hands stopped moving. "You told them?" "Not everything. Not who took them. Just that the documents were secured during my illness by someone I trust. That the evidence of any attempt to alter them would be prosecutable." "You didn't use my name." "No. You told me once that you didn't want to be part of this world." "I'm respecting that." She resumed cleaning. He watched her. "But they'll figure it out," she said. "They're not stupid." "No, they're not. But by the time they do, it won't matter. Because anyone who touches, you will answer to me. And everyone in that room today understands exactly what that means." It was not a romantic declaration. It was not a promise of love or devotion. It was something more fundamental, a rewriting of the rules. In Soder Kreshnik's world, Protection was currency. It was the highest form of respect. And he had just extended it, publicly and irrevocably, to a woman who cleaned his floors. "I don't need protection," Elodie said. "I know, you've proven that, but you have it anyway. Consider it the one thing I'm giving you that you can't refuse." She looked at him. He looked at her. The kitchen smelled of lemon cleaner and the faint trace of his cologne, something dark, something woodsy, something that had become as familiar to her as the sound of her own breathing. "Okay," she said, "but I'm still going to clean your bathroom, and you're still going to leave wet towels on the floor, and I'm still going to be annoyed about it." The sound that came from Soter Kreshnik's throat was something no one in his organization had ever heard. He laughed. It was brief, startled, almost involuntary. The laugh of a man rediscovering a reflex he had forgotten he possessed. But it was real, and Elodie, standing in his kitchen with a sponge in her hand, felt something shift inside her own chest. A warmth, a loosening, the sensation of a door opening in a room she had kept locked for reasons she was only now beginning to question. Spring came to Chicago the way it always does, grudgingly, with false starts and sudden retreats. The lake still iron gray, but the air carrying the faint promise of warmth. By April, Soter was fully recovered. His body had returned to itself. The leanness, the controlled physicality, the way he occupied space as though it owed him something. But the illness had left marks that were not physical. He moved differently now, not slower, more aware. He paused before entering rooms. He looked at people when they spoke, instead of past them. He asked questions that had no strategic value. He said please to the doorman, which sent a ripple of bewildered concern through the building staff, who assumed he was either testing them or dying again. He was neither. He was changing, slowly, imperfectly, with the awkwardness of a man learning a language he should have learned as a child, but changing. And the catalyst was obvious to everyone who saw them together. Elodie still came to the penthouse. Still cleaned, still cooked, but now she also stayed for dinner sometimes, sitting across from him at the long dining table that had never held more than one plate. They talked about books, about cities, about the strange alchemy of immigration, in how leaving one country doesn't mean arriving in another, how you can live in America for a decade and still dream in Arabic. She told him about her plans. She was saving money, slowly, methodically, with the patience of someone who understood that small amounts compound into freedom. She wanted to go back to school, study public health. She had seen too many people in her community, immigrants, undocumented, uninsured, suffer from conditions that were treatable, preventable, survivable, if only someone had intervened sooner. "Like what you did for me," he said one evening, the words coming out before he could stop them. She looked at him. That was different. Was it? She thought about it. "No," she admitted. "I suppose it wasn't." It was that evening that he made his offer. He did it carefully, because he had learned, from her, from the illness, from the long nights of silence and self-examination, that how you offer something matters as much as what you offer. "I want to fund your education," he said. "Full tuition. Whatever program you choose, no conditions, no strings. A scholarship, if you want to call it that. Administered through a foundation, not through me personally. You'd never have to see me or speak to me again if that's what you wanted." Elodie set down her fork. "That's a lot of money. It's money I have and you need. The math is simple." "The math isn't simple, Soter. Not between us." He knew what she meant. The imbalance, the power differential, the fact that accepting money from a man like him, regardless of intention, would transform their relationship from whatever fragile, honest thing it was into something transactional. "I know what you're thinking," he said, "and I understand it, but I need you to understand something too. What you did for me, not just the nursing, not just the documents, what you did was show me that a person could act out of goodness. Not strategy, not self-interest. Goodness. I didn't know that was real. I thought it was something people performed to get what they wanted." You showed me I was wrong. He leaned forward, and she saw in his eyes the same intensity she had seen the first day on the bathroom floor, but different. Not the intensity of a cornered animal. The intensity of a man trying to be better than he was. Letting me fund your education would not be accepting charity. It would be allowing me to do something good. Something that isn't strategic. Something that isn't about power. You would be giving me the chance to act the way you act, because it's right. The silence hummed between them. No, she said. He blinked. No. No. Not because I don't appreciate it, and not because I don't believe you mean it, but because I need to do this myself. I need to know that what I build is mine. Built by me. With my hands, and my money, and my time. The way I've built everything in my life. She met his eyes. You understand that. You built everything in your life the same way. He sat back. He looked at her as though she had just defeated him in a game he hadn't known they were playing. You're refusing a fortune, he said. Not angry, awed. I'm refusing dependence. There's a difference. And there it was. The thing that shocked them all. Not a dramatic revelation, not a courtroom scene or a boardroom confrontation. Just a 23-year-old woman sitting across from one of the most powerful men in Chicago, looking him in the eye and saying no. Not out of spite or pride, but out of the unshakable belief that her dignity was not for sale at any price. Drayton had said she was an opportunist. The captains had whispered that she was positioning herself. The world, his world, operated on the assumption that everyone had a price, that every act of kindness was a down payment on a future favor. Elodie Morcelli had no price, and in refusing to name one, she became the most powerful person in the room. Soder looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded. All right, he said. Then let me ask you something else, something with no money attached. Ask. Stay for dinner tomorrow. I'm here for dinner now. I mean, not as the maid, not as the woman who cleans my house, as someone I want to sit across from, as someone I want to talk to. He paused, and for the first time in their entire acquaintance, Soder Kreshnik looked uncertain. As someone I'm asking, not telling, asking. The distance between them, the marble countertop, the crystal glasses, the vast difference of their worlds, seemed to collapse into something small and intimate, like a letter folded and passed under a door. Yes, she said. Tomorrow. Tomorrow. And neither of them mentioned that when she left that night, his hand had brushed hers at the door, and both of them had felt it. That current, that terrifying charge, and neither of them had pulled away. The changes came gradually, the way all true transformations do, not in a single dramatic gesture, but in 1,000 small decisions, each one building on the last, each one a brick in a structure that was being built without blueprints. Soder restructured the businesses, not overnight. He was too strategic for that. But steadily, methodically, with the same precision he had once applied to darker operations. The construction firms became fully legitimate, their contracts audited and transparent. The restaurants expanded into neighborhoods that needed investment, not extraction. The loan enforcement operations were wound down, replaced by a community lending fund. Genshin Dushku nearly had a stroke when he saw the proposal that offered low-interest loans to small business owners in immigrant communities. You've lost your mind, Genshin said. I've found it, Soder replied, for the first time. The captains grumbled. Some left, attracted to organizations that still operated the old way. Soder let them go without retaliation, which was itself a revolution. In his world, departure was usually handled with far more permanent methods. Others stayed. They stayed because they sensed, in Soder's transformation, something they had been hungering for without knowing it. The possibility that a man could be powerful without being predatory. That strength could mean building rather than breaking. That the code of the Besa, the sworn word, the sacred promise, could apply not just to business agreements, but to a way of living. Dr. Hadjic became a friend. He came to the penthouse monthly, not for medical visits but for dinner and conversation. He and Soder would sit by the window, overlooking the lake, and talk about Bosnia, about Albania, about the wars that had shaped their families, about the immigrant experience of building a second life in a country that both welcomed and feared you. You know, Dr. Hadjic said one evening, swirling wine in his glass, in Sarajevo during the siege, the people who survived weren't always the strongest. They were the ones who found a reason to care about someone other than themselves. Soder looked toward the kitchen, where Elidi was arguing with a recipe on her phone, her hair escaping its headband, flour on her cheek. I know, he said. The relationship between Soder and Elidi evolved the way rivers carve canyons, with patience and inevitability. There was no declaration, no grand romantic scene, no moment where violins swelled and they fell into each other's arms. That kind of love belonged in movies, and their story was not a movie. Their story was made of quieter things. It was the way he saved a chair for her at his table without being asked. It was the way she corrected his pronunciation of Arabic words without apologizing for it. It was the way they disagreed, openly, sometimes sharply, always with the understanding that disagreement was not danger. One evening in late May, they sat on the balcony watching the sun set over Lake Michigan. The sky was the color of copper and rose, and the want to be. Not the kind I was. 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 Not the kind want to be. Not the kind I was. Not the kind my father wanted. Not the kind this city made me, but the kind I choose. She waited. I want to be the kind of man who deserves the kindness you showed me. I'm not that man yet. I may never fully be, but I want to try. And I want to try with you beside me, not behind me, not beneath me, beside me. She looked at the lake. She looked at the sky. She looked at him, this complicated, damaged, transforming man who had been her employer, her patient, her adversary, and was now something for which she had no adequate word. I'm still going to be a cleaning woman tomorrow, she said. I know. And I'm still going to go to school on my own terms, with my own money. I know. And I'm not going to become someone's trophy, or someone's redemption story, or someone's proof that they've changed. I know that too. Then what are you asking me, Soder? He turned to her. The last light caught the silver at his temples. His eyes, those dark, careful, guarded eyes, were open in a way she had never seen them. Vulnerable, afraid, and utterly, completely certain. "I'm asking you to let me love you," he said. "Not the way I've done everything else, with control and strategy and contingency plans, but the way you taught me, with honesty, with patience, without guarantees." The wind came off the lake, carrying the smell of water and the distant sound of the city. Somewhere below, a car horn sounded. Somewhere above, a plane traced a white line across the darkening sky. Elidi reached out and took his hand. Not the way a woman takes a powerful man's hand, tentatively, adoringly, looking up, but the way an equal takes the hand of another equal, firmly, calmly, looking straight ahead, facing the same horizon. "Okay," she said, "but I'm still not letting you pay my tuition." He laughed, that real, startled, human laugh that she had drawn from him like water from a stone. "I wouldn't dare," he said, and they sat there, on the 47th floor, above a city that had shaped them both in different ways, holding hands in the dusk, two people who had found each other, not through luck or destiny, but through the oldest, simplest, most radical act in the human repertoire. One person choosing to stay when everyone else had left. That was what she did. That shocked them all. Not a dramatic gesture, not a strategic move, not a play for power, or money, or protection. She stayed. And in staying, she changed everything. The community health clinic on West Devon Avenue opened on a Tuesday in March, in a renovated building that had once been a failed laundromat. It was not large. It was not glamorous. It had second-hand furniture in the waiting room, a donated X-ray machine that Dr. Hodgich had sourced from a hospital in Milwaukee, and a hand-painted sign that read, in English, Spanish, and Arabic, "Care for all, payment optional." The funding came from the Kreshnik Foundation, the legitimate charitable arm that Soder had established 6 months earlier, structured so carefully that Genshin Dushku had described it, grudgingly, as the most legally airtight act of philanthropy I've ever witnessed. The clinic served immigrants, undocumented workers, and anyone who fell through the cracks of a healthcare system designed for people with insurance and addresses. Elidi was there on opening day, not as a donor, not as a figurehead, as a volunteer, registering patients, translating between languages, doing the work she had always done, making herself useful in the spaces where usefulness mattered most. She was also, as of January, enrolled in the public health program at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Part-time, paid for with savings, a need-based scholarship she had applied for herself, and a small grant from a Moroccan-American women's education fund she had found through 3 hours of library research. She had refused Soder's money for the 4th time, and he had stopped offering, which was its own form of respect. They were together. That much was clear to anyone who saw them. The way he waited for her after class on the days their schedules aligned, the way she kept a toothbrush at the penthouse but insisted on maintaining her apartment in Pilsen, because a woman needs a room of her own, and Virginia Woolf was right about that. They did not perform their relationship for the world. They did not need to. What existed between them was too real and too hard-won to be reduced to display. Drayton had moved to Miami. He ran a legitimate real estate firm, kept his distance, and sent birthday cards that Soder opened, read, and kept in a drawer without comment. The wound between them had not healed. It might never heal entirely, but it had stopped bleeding, and sometimes that is enough. On the night of the clinic's opening, after the last patient had been seen and the last light had been turned off, Soder and Elidi stood on the sidewalk outside. The March wind was cold, but not cruel, the kind of wind that hints at warmer things coming. "Your grandmother would be proud of this place," Soder said. "My grandmother would say it needs better lighting in the waiting room." She'd be right. They walked to the car. He opened the door for her, not because she was delicate, but because he had learned that small courtesies were not weakness. They were practice. They were the daily exercise of becoming the man he wanted to be. As they drove north along the lake, the city glittering on one side and the vast black water on the other, Elodie reached across the console and took his hand. "Thank you," she said. "For the clinic, for, the foundation, for all of it. Don't thank me. You showed me what was possible. I just signed the checks." "You did more than sign checks, Soder. You changed. That's harder than writing numbers." He was quiet for a moment. The lights of the Drake Hotel slid past the window. The lake was endless. "I used to think power meant never needing anyone," he said. "I spent my whole life making sure I never had to depend on another person. And then I got sick, and everyone I thought was loyal disappeared. And the one person who stayed, the one person who had every reason to leave, was someone I had treated like she was invisible." He looked at her. Those dark eyes, still guarded, still cautious, but with windows now. With light. "You weren't invisible, Elodie. You were the only real thing in my life. I was just too blind to see it." She squeezed his hand. "I know," she said. "But you see it now, and that's what matters." The car moved through the city. The night was cold and clear and full of the kind of promise that only exists when two people have earned their way to each other through pain and patience and the stubborn refusal to be less than what they are. Soder Kreshnik had been a king of fear. He had ruled through silence and control and the careful administration of power. Now he was something more difficult, something braver. He was a man learning to be human, and beside him, neither above nor below, but exactly where she had always insisted on being, was the woman who had taught him how. The maid who stayed, the woman who changed everything, not with a weapon, not with a strategy, not with money or manipulation or any of the currencies his world understood. With mercy, with courage, with the radical, terrifying, world-altering act of giving a damn about someone who hadn't earned it yet, and believing, against all evidence, that he could. And he did.